This is Videomaster Victor Neustroyev, and today I conduct the webinar which is called Attacking Moves with the King. Well, attacking moves with the king sounds weird. How you can attack the enemy king with your king if they can't come closer to each other. But actually, sometimes if you want to succeed with your king side attack, or with the attack on the enemy king, you have to play with your king first. Okay, so we are waiting for more attendees to come. We started a little bit earlier, 2 minutes earlier, and let me adjust something. By the way, could you please let me know if the sound and video quality is good? I'm streaming this webinar on both platforms, Twitch and YouTube. Okay, perfect. So I see some people coming to chess.com, or some people coming to YouTube, as well as to Twitch. Good. By the way, please let me know about the sound. Is everything okay, or I need to improve something? Okay, today I prepared several games for you, but let's wait for more people. This is actually the first position we are going to talk about, where black pawns move up, and black has to come up with a winning plan, because if they don't do anything, white gonna capture and try to promote the pawn on h5. Okay, let's start. So if you look at this position, you may say, okay, well, what if I play e5, for example, to support the pawns, to be able to then push e2 and e1 equals queen? Unfortunately, e5 is a mistake. If this move is played, then rook to h5, with the idea of taking there. So, for example, e2, rook takes there, king comes to f3, and just h5. King f2, h6, e1 equals queen, doesn't work. White exchanges everything and then promotes first. This idea doesn't work, and instead white should black should play something else. So what ideas do you have, guys? Can you please suggest anything? Any suggestions of how black should play here? Okay, let me explain. Here, to be able to succeed, you can actually realize that white king is in trouble. It can't move, but two pieces are not enough to checkmate white king in this position. The black king should join the attack. And with this maneuver that black can play, black is able to deliver a checkmate. For example, king f3, white has no other move but maybe to take on e6, king comes to e2, then what? Moving the pawn doesn't make sense. King d2 then. So let's say they play rook d7, king d2. If they capture there, after king c2, there is nothing white can do to prevent a rook b3 or rook a1. Both are checkmates. So that's why this is the moment where white has to sacrifice the rook first. This move doesn't work just because of rook takes c3. That's why king takes a3. Rook f7. And in this position, if you play king d2, they're gonna check you with rook f2. But you can play knight d5 first, with the idea of knight e3 later in the game. For example, b5, and after king d2, white resigned. What do you think? Why did they resign? Yeah, hello everyone, especially newcomers. Please let me know if the video and sound quality is good. You can also, if you attend my webinar for the first time, you can also introduce yourself. Just tell me which country you are from and what's your ELO. It can be either chess.com or FIDE or USCF rating. So what do you think? Why did white resign? How black should continue after that? Oh, well, first of all, in this position after king d2, this move can be played. And then what happens after king c3? No, actually, let me answer this question myself. For example, if rook f3 is just knight e3 and you are still threatening with a mate on a1, and if king goes there, it's just rook takes there to threaten a mate. Oh, it's actually not a mate. It's almost a mate. So, for example, let's say g4 maybe. But then king takes. Well, but then maybe d3. If rook takes there, it's king c2, threatening a mate, or threatening to promote. For example, if king a3, it's d2, and then the pawn is promoted. If they take here first, it's knight c2, and there is no defense. Oh, well, there is a defense, sorry. Well, if so, then you... Oh, here probably you have to... What do you think, guys? What black should play in this position? Rook b2? Yeah, rook b2. And after this move, check on c2, king goes there, and after knight d4, we're threatening with the mate and to capture the rook. So this is how black wins. So if rook f2, king c3, and king a2, in this position, it's just rook b5 with the idea of this. For example, rook f3, king takes c2, threatening to promote and to checkmate. So here, to be able to win the game, black has to activate their king to be able to create a mating net for the enemy king. And only this idea was a winning plan for black in this position. That was actually a game fragment from the game between Boris Gelfand and Alexander Shabalov. Now the other example of Boris Gelfand's game, it's white to move. How would you continue? Okay, rook b3 and b4. Well, what do you mean? Rook f3 is another suggestion. Rook f3 is one of the suggestions and rook b3 is the other one. Okay, let's start with rook f3. If you play this move, it leads to a draw. For example, king e8. Rook f5, b3. Rook a5, threatening with a mate, but rook b8. And the pawn is very close to the queen in square. Rook b3 still doesn't win, because after king e8, I just don't see what white should do to continue and to play for a win. If, for example, g4, it's rook b6, and it's a kind of a Zugzwang. If the rook moves, it's b3. And if king d5 in this position, it's king d7, of course. If king d5 here, I believe it's just b3. And after king c6, even b2. So it's unlikely to work. What else you can suggest, guys? Okay, so there is a good question, what is good to do after the Juco piano? Well, it depends. I will answer your question a little bit later after we will finish the analysis of this concrete position. Rook g4. Well, yes, rook g4 is the best. Why rook g4? Well, let's decide how to play. For example, if b3, you can play rook a4 with the idea of a checkmate. So rook b8, but this time rook f4, and now if the king goes there, it's d7. Well, if the king goes there, it's a check. And then after the rook's exchange, it's d7. To stop the pawn, they have to play king c7, but then king e7 and you promote with a check. So king e8, it's here, and after a check you exchange and promote. So b3 doesn't work at all. But maybe king e8 is a better move. Well, if this move is played, then we can continue with rook c4, still threatening with the mate. And if in this position they continue with king d8, then just rook c5, with the idea to do the same thing through the a5 or f5. For example, b3, rook a5, rook has to move to b8, and now this move. The rook went away from the 7th rank, what means that we can push the pawn to d7 on the next step. For example, king e8, d7, the same story. If king c8, then check, exchange, and push the pawn to d7. So rook c4, rook b8, rook c7. If now, well, it's difficult to suggest anything else, but if king f8, rook f7, if this move it's d7 and then rook f8, so king g8 instead, but still d7. And after b3, what do you think? What's the best option? Rook f1. Yes, you're absolutely right. Not rook f2, but rook f1. Rook f1, because if this time b2, it's king e7. If you played rook f2 instead, after b2 they're threatening to promote. You can just take. This is what you mean. Well, yes. Well, it works as well. But after rook f1 and b2, you can just push the king forward, and after b1 you take and promote, and then win the game. So if b3 right now, rook takes g7, threatening with a mate, so king f8, rook f7, king g8, and then d7. And after b2, it's the same story, rook f1, and the king is cut off, so your next move is king e7 and d8. So with this move, white was able to activate the king and prove that the king into the attack can be quite helpful, especially in the endgame. Because of this king, these ideas of checkmate using the back rank were possible. Okay, now let's talk about different king moves, and we continue. And we continue with this game. It's Bobby Fischer. Okay. Well, I promised to answer about Italian game, Gioco Piano. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, well, bishop c5. If knight f6 is played, well, you can of course play d3 and then knight g5. Oh, sorry, you can play either d3 or knight g5. Well, if you know knight g5, it works pretty well, but the positions there are quite sharp. So knight a5, check, take, take, bishop d3 or bishop e2 is also a good move, and your main idea is to exchange the knights through the e4 square. But it's not obligatory to learn these lines. If you prefer to play French defense, you can continue castle, knight f6, d3, no, d6 maybe, or what? Well, d6, here a4, castle, no, h3, h6, rook e1, and in this position, well, sorry, every time d6 is played, you may already play c3, because it's quite often when black castles, well, let's say, then what, rook e1 or a4, well, a4. No, actually rook e1 is a better move. They may continue with d5. And if so, you'd better keep this square for the knight and develop your knight later to this square. For example, knight takes d5. And in this position, you can actually... No, you can't capture the pawn. If you capture the pawn, it's queen f6. So here you have to play knight bd2. And now you are threatening to take the pawn. For example, if let's say bishop e6, then you can capture. Knight takes knight, rook takes, bishop f2. And here, after this move, queen f6 doesn't work because you have knight f3. However, if I'm not mistaken, in this position they can play queen h4 right away. And this is where you have to react knight e4, leaving your knight on e5 hanging. But then you continue with bishop g1 move. They play bishop f2. Now the king goes to h1. And if they don't want to give up the material, they have to take on e1, because the queen has almost no squares to move to. Well, I think I'm missing something. Yeah, I think I'm missing something. Wait a sec, guys. Let me explain it in a different way. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, then you castle. You do not need to play c3 too early because they're gonna play knight f6 and d5. Knight f6, d3, castle, h3. And if now they play d5, you take, knight takes d5, and then you continue with rook e1. So if they play bishop e6, then you cannot capture right now, but you can play knight bd2, and after that the pawn is hanging. For example, bishop b6, which is an ordinary move, then you take there. Queen h4, knight e4, and if knight takes there, bishop g5, bishop takes there, king h1. So they have to give up the queen because the queen is trapped. Queen h5, that was a double attack. Bishop comes to f6, and then you just take there and play this position, so you are able to gain one minor piece back. And here white is slightly better with the queen versus rook, bishop, and one pawn. If they do not play d5 but continue with d6, then c3. For example, here there are two moves, a6 or a5. No, let me show just a6. a4, to be able to escape with the bishop, if needed. Bishop a7, rook e1. And in this position, you either play d4 or continue with this slow plan, knight d2, knight f1, and bishop e3. For example, h6, knight bd2, rook e8, b4, and if bishop e6 you exchange and then play something like that. In one of the games between Grishchuk and Nepomniachtchi, it was queen c2 and queen d7. Yeah, Nepomniachtchi and Grishchuk. Nepomniachtchi played knight c4 because he prepared for d5. E takes d5, queen takes d5, and knight e3 which looks really good. The queen is under attack and it provokes them to take. In this position, white has slightly more chances to succeed. Okay, that was the answer of how to play against Italian, but of course you need to study all these lines in details. Let's now continue our webinar. So we are talking about the attacking king's moves. For example, in this position, it's the fragment of the game between Robert Fischer and Svetozar Gligoric. What do you think white should do in this position? They have some strong potential of the kingside attack. But which exact move to play? So the webinar is recording. If you miss something about Italian game, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel and later watch the recording of this webinar. This is the link to my YouTube channel. Okay, so king b1, this is what Will suggested. Rook h5 is too optimistic, it doesn't work. Parallax is thinking about f5. Yeah, f5 looks like an ordinary move in such positions, with the idea to get the control over the d5 square, but right now f5 doesn't work. Because of e takes f5, knight d5, threatening with a fork. But in this position, black has a very, very solid response. It's queen a2, threatening with dangerous check. For example, if in this position, well, what? If this move, king f8, knight takes c8, queen takes b2. King goes there, rook takes c8, and this is black who attacks in this position. You, of course, may ask me, what if they capture the queen? Well, if so, it's rook c2, king has to go to b1, and rook b2. So they keep the attack and finally gain the queen back. No, of course, queen d4, to not lose the queen for free, but to take the bishop at least for that queen. However, after rook c5, looks like black is winning here. So, in this position, knight d5 right now doesn't work because of queen a2. So that's why f5 is a mistake. That's why first Bobby Fischer plays a prophylaxis, king b1. And now he is threatening with f5. Queen b6 was played in the game. Queen f3, rook c5, to control f5 with one more piece, and in this position Bobby played queen d3, which is actually not the best move. It's marked as a strong move, but actually there was a move that is better than these. F5, for example, e takes f5, but no, knight d5, then queen d8. So then g5 is hanging, but you can play rook h5. And after g takes h5, continue with knight f4. Well, no, not knight f4, because you lose the control over the c3 square. But you may play g6 and pressure on f7. However, f5 is not the best option. Instead, you'd better capture on h5. Well, king safety first sometimes makes sense, sometimes not. If there is nothing concrete that can damage your king, then you'd better save a temper and play with something else. But if you see that there is a concrete threat, or there will be a concrete threat later in the game, you may play this prophylaxis. So it's always better not to lose tempers on the moves that are not required. But if you believe that this move is helpful anyway, either now or later in the game, you can do it in advance. So rook h5, g takes h5, queen takes h5, with the idea of f5 or rook h1. No, rook h1 doesn't offer much because queen h7 is not a checkmate. But f5 and g6 are really good moves. For example, bishop e8, f5, e takes f5, and here with knight f4 you have a strong attack. Oh, I don't think this line works for black. Just knight d5, and you're threatening with knight f6. No, knight c3, of course. For example, if they take there, then a takes b3, and your next move is rook h1. Oh, let's say maybe queen to a5, but if so, just knight f6 wins. If they take, there is nothing to talk about. If they move the king to f8, it's queen h7, and again, if they capture, the king cannot escape. If not, then you play this and then take. e5, no, I don't think e5 works here. e5, d takes e5, what's the point? Ah, well, you can continue with f5. f5, and if they take, then g6. Or knight a4 is a good move, actually. Yeah, knight a4 makes sense here because bishop a4 is impossible. Queen f7, rook h1 leads to a checkmate. Well, maybe, but f5 looks better, so e5 can be played, but you have to play f5 anyway. So rook h5 was the best move. Instead, Bobby played queen d3. Bishop c3, knight takes c3, knight takes f4, but queen f3. And he's ready to sacrifice on h5, which exactly happened in the game. It's difficult to suggest something else, because if e5 in this position, white wins after knight e2. The knight is pinned, and we also have the idea to attack through the h file. For example, bishop e6, knight takes f4. If they capture there, queen takes there. So, and something like that doesn't work. It's just queen f6 with a mate in 1 after that. I'll show you. So bishop b3, queen f6, and all these checks are only one check. If queen d8, it's queen h2 with the same idea. So knight h5, and this is where Bobby sacrificed with a deadly attack. Queen h6 to prevent the king from escaping. They sacrificed. They probably had no other move, and after g6 their position is ruined. Well, actually not rook h1. If rook h1, it's queen d4 to control h8, but g6. Now queen d4 cannot be played, so the queen is unable to join the defense on the king's side. F takes g6, rook h1, queen d4, and after queen h7 they resigned. Well, actually it was better to play bishop e6, because bishop f7 is the only option, but then queen h7 and queen f7. However, Bobby Fischer played queen here, and after king f8 he had this move in mind, but actually didn't happen. After queen h7 Grigorich resigned. So what you may learn, sometimes to continue the attack you have to do the prophylaxis and move the king away, especially if you see a concrete threat to the king, and this threat stops your king's side attack. The next game I would like to demonstrate is this one between let me check. Between Boris Spassky and Lev Pologaevsky. Boris Spassky played really well, but unfortunately lost the game. let's look. So knight f6, c4, e6. If you are following my announcements, probably you saw this the fragment of this game in one of the announcements. So knight e4 to simplify. Knight takes knight, bishop takes e4, and to keep more pieces on the board, white decided to play bishop f4. Castle, bishop d3, and here black decided to play this sneaky move with the idea to provoke white to play knight d2, but knight d2 leaves the bishop on d3 hanging. That's why king f1. No, king e2 was also possible in this position. King e2, for example, bishop takes f3, g takes f3, and f5 to restrict the bishop. And I can't say that white is much better in this position, but well, it's still playable. Because of the g file, white can initiate an attack on the enemy king. However, they first decided to play king f1. Bishop d3, queen d3, bishop e7. And now I have a question for you. How would you continue the attack here? This is oh, sorry, you can't see the who is playing. This is Boris Spassky playing against Lev Polugaevsky. Boris Spassky is a world champion, and Lev Polugaevsky is he was a winner of Soviet Union championship several times. So he was also a strong grandmaster, but he never was a challenger. And he never, no, of course he wasn't a world champion. So g4, this is what you suggest. Well, g4 makes sense in this position. What else? G4, maybe king g2, right? Rod Trip suggests h4, which looks natural here. Well, yes, I agree with you about h4. In my opinion, it's better than g4. Let's try g4. Well, g4, probably d5 to open up the position. But then you can play h4, so this move also deserves attention. h4 was played in the game. And this is where black realizes that they should somehow stop g4. And they played f5. Can you guess the second move, I mean the next move white played? Oh, you mean g4, but well, g4, f takes g4, and then what? Knight g5? Well, then rook f5. You cannot play e4, I just captured there. So I don't think it works. So it looks like g4 right now cannot be played. If you start with knight g5 right away, well, then h6, and you have to retreat. Anything else? So king e2. Well, maybe h5 was the best, but king e2 is a very natural move with the idea of rook g1 and g4 after that. It was d6 and g4. Well, d6 was a kind of inaccuracy, because now, after f takes g4, it's knight g5, and e6 is hanging together with h7. For example, if bishop takes, h takes g5, h7 is hanging. And, well, the only defense is this. But what do you think now? How white should continue? Rook h7 is too optimistic, I think. Oh, Rook h7 is unlikely to work. Rook h6 works, yes, I agree with you. Rook h6 and then you double. This is what works. Queen e4 looks good because after knight d7 you can take on e6. And after king g7 move you can just capture on g4 and end up with a strong attack. And of course some extra material. But Rook h6 is good enough. Well, yes. Okay, there is a good comment from Parallax who told that actually looks like king f1 is a mistake because it was better to play king e2 first. But if bishop f3, g takes f3 and f5 in this position, well, there is no strong prospect of this attack while the bishop is blocked. So you need to play e4, but every time you play e4, you create some problems for yourself on the f file. So here actually the attack doesn't look so strong as it was in this position after king e2. So d6, g4, and f takes g4 was a mistake because of knight g5. Knight d7. Of course, rook ag1, and white is much better here. Well, with a strong attack, so threatening with this, and bishop h6 after that. So that's why black decided to play f takes g4, which was not the best move. Instead, they'd better continue with queen e8 to bring the queen closer. But okay, rook g4, knight f6 with a temper, rook g5. It was important to play rook g5 to prevent this move. Otherwise, the knight could successfully block the pawn and attack the bishop. What happened then? Well, if it's difficult to find a good move with the knight, if for example they retreat, you can just ignore the fact that the rook is hanging and continue with queen e4, threatening to take there. And if bishop takes there, first you take with the knight and threaten with several ideas. And queen e6 as well. So rook g5 was played, and they played queen d7 to secure the pawn on e6 and maybe to protect the 7th rank if needed. How would you continue the attack? What do you think? Yeah, h5 and h6. Yeah, h5 and then you double the rooks. That is better. So h5, knight e8. The rook now has to retreat. And Polugaevsky decided to play on the other side. And with b5 he wants a counter play on the queen side. But if you want to hold the initiative, you have to keep the position closed. That's why Boris Spassky plays c5. D takes c5 was played in the game, and now white is completely winning. That was a kind of inaccuracy. Instead, they could try maybe this move to prevent queen e4. So d takes c5, what's wrong with this move? How white should continue to prove they are winning? One important thing of d takes e5 is that it leaves the e5 square for our pieces to join the attack. Yes, exactly. King Marcher is absolutely correct. So knight e5, you think? Well, if you play knight e5, they continue with queen d5. What then? Maybe instead of knight e5, you can suggest a better move. Okay, it's always, I'm glad to hear that I help you with all these advices. Actually, last time when I conducted a blitz simul, there were more players. I mean, there were more attendees. So that's why I don't know, guys, if you are more interested in some fun activities like playing Blitz, playing Simals, or instead the educational webinars. Yeah, h6 works here. h6 first, and if, for example, they continue with c4, white can checkmate with queen h7. King takes h7, h takes g7, a discovery check. King g8, take here with a discovery check. King has to take because this is a double check. Then rook h8, king f7, and knight e5. No, it's not the end. King f6, knight d7. If this move is played, it's a rook h5. King goes there and just f3. Checkmate. If king goes back, it's knight f5, king f6, and e4 first with the idea of rook g6. This is how white could win the game. Well, c4 wasn't played actually. This is where Pologoyevsky decided that it's too risky to let the queen attack h7 and played rook f5. But bishop e5, adding more pressure there. c4. Now queen e4. Queen d5 is the only move, but queen replaces to g4, so g7 is now hanging. c3, a kind of a counterplay, but b3. b4, with the idea of delivering checks and entering white's camp. What do you think? What white should do here? This is where white decided to secure their king. But how exactly to play it? What do you think, guys? King f1 or knight f1? Well, which move? Knight e1 or king f1? Knight e1, but what's knight e1 with the idea of knight d3 probably. Well, I think it's too slow for this concrete position. D1. King d1 with the idea to stop the pawn, but if king d1 is played, they can continue with king d1, queen b5, threatening with queen d3. It's quite dangerous. So I think this is where they took Spassky took a very optimal decision. He played e4. The idea of this move was not to fork, but to locate the king on e3, where the king is safer than on d1, for example. Queen b5, king e3. And of course, not king to e1 because of queen d3, threatening with c2. Or threatening with this, actually. And if bishop g7 in this position, bishop g5 could be played, threatening with this move. So, and if knight g5, it's c2. The file is overloaded, and white can't take the advantage of the enemy king being weak. Instead, their king is weak. So, queen b5, king comes to e3. Rook f7 to secure the g7, but h takes g7 anyway. Well, knight f6 was played, bishop f6, rook takes f6, And what do you think? What was the final move after which the position is absolutely winning for white with no chances for black? Who can tell me? Yes, your guys correct. It's Rook h7. Rook h7. Well, if King h7, it's over. G8 to open the G file, and well, that's it actually. Rook takes, Queen checks, and Rook h2. No, not Rook h2, but Queen h8 is better. Rook h2 leads to Queen h5. So Rook F3 was played instead. Oh, if this move, of course, it's Bishop G5, and then white had serious problems. But King F3, Queen D3 check, King F4 is not a problem. Bishop E5 check, King G5, King H7, and this is where Boris Spassky played a critical mistake. He played King H5 because he thought that, well, the H5 is a safe square for the queen. But there is something he missed. What do you think was the better move for white in this position? Not King H4. King H4, then Bishop E7. And you still have to move the king to H5. Well, what's wrong with King H5? We will see it a little bit later. But yes, King F6 is the best move. So you see here, they have to move with the king to be able to attack the enemy king. For example, Queen D4, which is the only other check, King F7, and no more checks. White is threatening with everything. Not Rook H2 because of Bishop H2, of course. But Queen G6, Queen H5, G8, everything. King H5, the move that he plays, actually equalizes the position. Queen B5. And if E5 here, it's just Queen E8. And then after king goes there, King G8. And well, if they take, it's C2. So it's an unclear position with good chances for black to win. So he played King H4, Bishop E7, King H3. And after Queen G5, he realized that the position is completely losing. Oh, well, actually, it's not. It's not a losing position, but this is where he resigned for some reason. I don't know why. But in my opinion, C2 Rook comes to C5 is good. So if Rook G8 in this position, then Rook C5 is still okay. Rook G7, but you can undermine with A3. I would continue playing this position and maybe would end in a draw. But here, after King H7, he just missed this attacking move with the king, which could lead to a checkmate much faster than King H5, which finally failed. Okay, there was a good question about rook h6 after the king takes back. Well, here, no. If king takes, well, if this move, then rook h6 probably, but g8 is a winning move. G8, and if this move, it's just queen g7. And, well, if they take, it's take, and queen h8. Okay, and then one more game. Well, actually this game is too long. We have only one game to analyze, and let it be, I mean, we have time only for one game to analyze, and let it be the game between Vladimir Kramnik and Peter Lecko. Well, Kramnik played really well, and he created a strong attack, but at a certain moment of the game he realized that he needs to move the king in order to apply his main idea. e4 c5, it was Paulson Sicilian, which later transposed to Kan Sicilian, or we can call it Scheveningen Sicilian. Castle b5. Actually, b5 doesn't look so good. It's too early to play this move. b5 works better in a different move order. For example, in this position, b5 looks really good. Here, b5 is a kind of a mistake because of knight c6, which Kramnik played, of course. Because if queen c6, it's bishop f3 with the idea of e5, and playing e5 themselves means to leave the d5 square as the outpost for the knight. So d takes c5 instead, bishop e3, bishop b7, and f4, a typical way to take the control over the center. Moreover, in this position, one of the main ideas of white is to push the pawn to f5 to expose the king, especially while the king is still in the center. c5, f5. Well, there were tons of different moves played by other people, by other top players. However, Peter Lecko chose the best one. He played rook d8. However, white is already better because of a better development and the strong and the huge prospect of their kingside attack. Queen e1. Well, playing something like that is a mistake. F takes e6, f takes e6, and who can tell me what then? How white proves that b4 and actually playing with pawns is a mistake here. While you're thinking, guys, I would like to remind you, actually no, to announce that on Friday, the upcoming Friday, I'm going to play a blitz match with the chess nerd, the guy who I already played with, and I won that match. We played 3+2. This time he asks to play 3+0, so with no increment. And well, I have almost no, well, I didn't play with no increment for a long time, and actually, well, I am better with 3+2 or 5+3, but without increment I may lose, so our chances are more equal. So I will be streaming it here on Twitch. That's why I kindly recommend you to join. This blitz match will happen on Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So queen f2, no, I don't think queen f2 works. Queen f2, they can play knight f6 actually. Now here you can play better. Okay, so Friday 10 a.m. EST. Well, guys, knight b5, which you also suggested here, it doesn't make sense in my opinion. Then bishop c6. Here you can initiate a strong initiative in case if you first sacrifice the rook and then play knight f4 with the idea to take on c5. Because right now you're threatening with a check and then to gain the material back. Or you can just take with the knight and threaten to take on e6. For example, knight f6, knight takes c5. Bishop c8, queen b4. You more than compensate the exchange sacrifice. So let's go back. Queen e1, knight f6 was played. F takes e6. F takes e6, bishop f4, provoking e5 move. Well, yes. So bishop d6, for example, is impossible, of course, because of e5. And after bishop f5, bishop takes bishop queen e5, there is a discovered attack after this or that move. Well, no, bishop h5 doesn't work. Bishop b5 only works. Okay, e5. Bishop g5, fighting for the d5 square. Bishop e7 and a4. If now b4 was played, Kramnik wanted to play bishop f6. Bishop takes f6 and then knight d5, with the idea to, well, to activate the light square bishop. For example, rook d5 means maybe bishop a6 and then bishop c4. All the pawns are located on dark squares, and black has only their dark square bishop, which is bad. So queen d6, bishop h5, g6, and bishop comes to g4. So taking on d5 here is a mistake. Well, it just gives up the bishop on f6. That's why c4 was played. A takes b5, a takes b5, and this move doesn't work because of queen b6. So what do you think? Which move did Vladimir Kramnik play on the next step? Okay, yes, guys. Now you're absolutely right. So you play almost like Kramnik. Yes, king h1 here. King h1. Well, because this move offers a lot. For example, another possible way and another possible idea is rook takes f6. But this time, this idea doesn't work. Well, if g takes f6, it's bishop to h5, offering a strong attack. If bishop takes, it's still bishop h5, and after g6, everyone wants to capture on f6 and deliver a fork, but this fork doesn't work because of this check. So in order to continue the attack, you first have to play king h1. So here king h1 was no, not a prophylaxis, but also an attacking move which could allow white to succeed with their original idea. b4 and bishop f6. Bishop takes f6, knight d5, with the same ideas of activating the light squared bishop. Bishop takes d5, it takes d5. They played queen c5. Okay, good comment. Sorry, let me show it. Rook f6, bishop f6, bishop h5, g6. So there was a good remark about queen f2, which may work here. Well, no, this move doesn't work. Queen takes queen, and the king is on f2, so black castles and gains the bishop back, getting the advantage. They have extra exchange. For example, bishop f3 and rook takes f6. Oh, if this move, then bishop e4. So black is winning. Okay, let's continue. So knight d5, queen c5. This time it's not a check. Well, if they capture with the rook, it's just rook a8 or queen b4. You can start with this move, and after rook d8 you can exchange, and after queen d8 just take there and then there with two passed pawns. But actually I'm not sure if you need to promote them, because you have good chances to checkmate the king while it's unable to castle. So e takes d5, queen c5, bishop h5 check. No, g6 doesn't work because of rook f6, king e7. And now white takes the advantage of the most weak files into the most weak squares into black position, and these squares are a7, e6, and g7, and all the f file. So they play queen g3 with the idea of sacrifice, and queen g7 then, or rook f1 in case if the king takes. That's why g6. How would you continue? Well, rook f8, you mean rook takes f6 or what? Alexei, can you please comment your move, rook f8? Or is it suggestion for black to play instead of g6? Rook f6. Okay, yeah. Yes, you guys are absolutely correct. It's rook f6. King takes f6, and this rook joins the attack. Well, if king e7 after queen e5, it's time to resign. They played king g7. This time queen e5 looks well, but there is a better move that Kramnik played. He played bishop g6 to expose the king, and then he was able to checkmate the enemy king with these two pieces. Queen e5, king g8 was played in the game, but what if king h6? If so, you should continue with rook f4, threatening with a mate. There is nothing that can be done. They can sacrifice the queen, but it only delays. If they play g5, it's queen f6. Well, if king h5, it's queen f7, and then checkmate on f6. If king h7, it's still it's the same story, rook f6. So, and after king g8, queen e6. King has to move to the 7th rank. Doesn't really matter where, because we join our rook into the attack. And after this move, it's easy to checkmate. Queen h3, king g5, queen g3. If now he goes, well, he has only two squares to move to. And if he goes to h6, it's queen h4 mate. That's why he goes to h5. But after queen e5, the game is over. Black resigned. Why? Well, if this move, it's just queen e2. Queen e2. And after this, g3, king h3, and queen f1. Because if the king goes to g4, it's over after, well, it's a long combination, but still leads to a checkmate. If g4 in this position, then rook f5, and after king h6, it's a linear mate, like that. And if king h6, this time, well, if king h6, this time you have to play in a different way. You have to continue with rook g7. Because with rook g7, you are threatening with this move and with this move. And with this move as well. So you have several threats. They can't defend against all of them. Well, this is how Kramnik won the game. So you see, it's quite often actually when you want to succeed with the attack, you first have to play with the king. So today we analyze 3 different types of attacking moves with the king. First, the moves with the king in order to shoulder or to trap, like we did in this position, to trap the king on the edge to create a mating net. Some kind of prophylaxis, like it was played here by Bobby Fischer. And here, king h1, kind of an attacking move, so it's a part of the attack. With this move, only with this move, white was able to continue their strong attack. Okay, guys, do you have any questions? Please don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can also send me a friend request to not miss my announcement on chess.com. So this is the link to my profile. Yeah, maybe the games are too complex, but the first 2 were really not simple, but I think even a beginner could understand them. So, and I kindly recommend you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Let me share the link again. As well as to Twitch. So I'm not sure if I should conduct the webinar next Sunday. Maybe again I will announce a blitz. So this is the link to my YouTube channel. So next, I mean, the upcoming Friday, I play a blitz match against the Chess Nerd. Next Sunday, I'm going to maybe play a blitz simul again. So just tell me what you think is better, an educational webinar or a blitz when I play blitz against all my subscribers. Everybody, if anyone wants to join, I'll be glad to play against him. Last time I lost several games, so you have a chance to beat a FIDE master. So 2 gems I can. So you think webinar? Okay, what do I think about the 2 GMs that are coming to play? Well, which GMs? Okay, and there is a good question about king h1 in this position. What if they push the b pawn, right? And then castle? No, then this is actually what happened. Ah, you mean give up the pawn on b5 and castle in this position? Yes, that was a better line, but it's actually a losing position without a pawn, especially against such a strong grandmaster as Vladimir Kramnik. Okay, so let me think about the webinar. I will also talk to my assistant what she suggests, the webinar or blitz. Good luck with your games, and I hope you get better every time you attend my webinar. See you on Friday and then next Sunday. Thank you for coming.